Good afternoon. Welcome to the, I think it's the second or the third Balanced Living Lecture of the year. We are here today to talk about the joy of living with Dr. Walter Smitson, who is our guest and who has been here before. He's a professor of psychiatry and the director of the Central Clinic here in town. And he's going to give us some tips about how to inject purposeful, joyful moments into our lives. Mm-hmm. Just a few housekeeping things. On November 15th will be our next lecture, and that one is going to be by Shawn Cotton, who is the Director of Integrative Health for UC, and she's going to talk to us about mindfulness and the use of it at UC, including the law school. They now have a mindfulness class at the law school. And if anyone is looking to make a donation to the Bar Foundation, please keep in mind that we have a health and well-being fund at the Bar Foundation and would appreciate you targeting your donation to us. And with that, I'm going to give this over to Mr. Smitson so he can, Dr. Smitson, so he can bring us up to date on joy.
I want to mention my wife, Trish, who's here. I'm sure many of you know her. She is a lawyer who is enjoying retirement. I want to invite you to relax and get all other thoughts out of your mind and just listen to what I have to say, and hopefully can give you some tips on enriching your life and protecting the joy that you have or building the joy if you don't. And then when we get to Q&A, and I hope to leave plenty of time for that because I think that's what really allows people to ask what they want to know about. And when we get to Q&A, I'm going to ask Bob Biegner to start that off. So do I need a... No, a little louder. Okay. To start that off, because Bob always has good questions and comments, so he can start off the Q&A. This is a great topic. As we know, more and more people are trying to find happiness in their lives. Reports of depression is on the increase. Primary care docs and OBGYN doctors are handing out more and more medications for depression and anxiety. A recent study just came out that showed that ages between 12 and 37, suicide now is the second leading cause of death. Behavioral scientists have been spending years trying to find out what makes people happy and what makes them unhappy. I'm going to be telling you about what I think is a dramatic research story about changing our view of how the brain functions and how we can make the brain work to improve our lives. Regarding this finding, there's enormous possibilities of redirecting your brain and redirecting your behavior. We first need to recognize that happiness is associated with longevity and with health. Trish's mom has always been a very happy person, and she's about to celebrate her 102nd birthday. Now, I don't recommend that anybody try to live that long because seeing what her struggles are at 102, I think that it challenges the quality of life at that age. But nonetheless, that's her age. And I believe that everyone has the power to redirect their behavior, redirect their attitudes, and I'll be filling in some information on how you do that. I'll walk you through ways to create joy, ways to have some, and I'll have some examples, some case examples for you of people that have been able to change their lives and change their fears based on redirecting their brain functions. There's a book called Joy that actually Bob and I have both read through a book club. It's by the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. They got together for a week and did what Freud would probably call free association. They had no agenda, they just talked. And they had a scribe who wrote down most of what they said and then published a book from it. There's two ideas that I picked up from the book. One idea is mental immunity, and that's in your flyer, by the way, for this session. How to hold on to your joy by developing immunity from the stresses that everybody faces. As you know, when people get knocked down, the question is how much resilience do they have? And some people get back up and go on their way. Some people get up, but they're forever wounded. And some people never get off the mat when they're knocked down. In preparing for this, I asked a few people to give me one word that they associate with joy. So I got words like peace, money, family, contentment, and from Trish I got retirement. There are two ideas from the book. One is the idea of what happens when people get knocked down, mental immunity. And then the other idea is using the ocean as a metaphor, which I like. And the idea there is that we should think of life as on the surface of the ocean. There are always things that we're struggling with. There's in the ocean itself, there's storms and lightning and hail and wind. But down deep, the ocean is always calm. So it's useful to think about that for yourselves, that whatever you're dealing with on the surface, you have to work to not let it disrupt what is down deep, hopefully serenity and hopefully a joy about life. Learning to deal with the challenge of dealing with working with surface issues and not allowing that to disrupt what is down deep for you is one of the most challenging yet doable things that we can think of in preserving our own joy. My idea is the stage for joy is set when everything's going well in our lives. Our family's doing well, our children are doing well in school, they're not vaping, they're not dropping out of school, and our health is good, our work is good, our finances are good. But the big question is, how do we protect that joy? And I want to talk about three things that are challenges to our joy. One can be genetics, although it's not always a challenge, but we know genetics can give us a hand of cards that can be very difficult. It's popular these days for people to check out their genetics, and some people find some pretty big shocks in doing that. So I urge you to give a lot of thought if you're thinking of doing that, because you may get some surprises. Genetics can be good or bad in your mood, depending on what hand of cards you were dealt with. We know that genetics are definitely associated with addiction. We know it's associated with the work ethic. Genetics can become an excuse to be unfriendly or to be moody. The person saying, well, I'm just like my dad or just like my mom. I said to one such person, I think you want to shoot a little higher because your dad's been divorced 3 times and lost 2 jobs. So genetics are not always a reason to set your bar to that level. The other barrier is excessive habitual behavior. It's very interesting. We're told by behavioral scientists that 40 to 80% of everything we do is a habit. And that's very interesting. If you're up close to the 80%, you're at much more risk of a fall, an accident, making bad decisions. So the lesson there is to be much more intentional and not to allow yourself to be behaving based on habit. Now, I give you a personal example of that. Trish and I go in the kitchen each morning, and she gets there before I do, and she sets my coffee cup on the coffee pot. I put the pot in and hit the brew button and turn around to get the rest of what I'm planning to eat for breakfast. So recently she took our 9-year-old granddaughter and left town for 4 days to meet up with some cousins down at Mammoth Cave. So I was on my own for 4 mornings. So 2 of those 4 mornings, I went in the kitchen, put the pot in for coffee, pushed the brew button, turned around, only to discover I had a cup of coffee on the counter. So I'd had such a habit of not having to put the cup in. And that's the thing that can betray us so easily instead of being intentional. The third barrier to joy is unresolved trauma. It's a very important one. Today in the mental health field, we spend much less time when you first start therapy, much less time talking about what happened in your early years. We certainly look at that, but we're more interested in the traumas that you've had throughout your life, and particularly interested in the ones that you have not resolved, because those likely are the reasons that you're coming in for help. You have some depression from a trauma you have not resolved, or some guilt, or some other thing that's causing you to not get beyond that particular trauma. It's useful, too, to look at the stages that people go through when trauma hits them. One stage is, the first stage is denial and shock, and these are known pretty well to most everyone. People think this is a bad dream, this can't be happening. That stage gives way to depression and anger. And the anger can be toward oneself, or it can be toward other people. And this is called going through the tunnel. If you get to the next stage in that tunnel, it's called premorbid functioning. That means that if you're resolving whatever hit you, you're able to resume your level of functioning before the incident. Now, that means your relationships should return back to normal before the incident, your productivity, and the state of your inner self, how serene or not serene that was before the event hit you. Now, what is the goal? People have often asked me through the years, well, how do you know when you're all the way through the tunnel and you've worked it through? And when can I stop therapy? The answer is when the negative event is a memory with no emotion. Now think about that. You get to a point that it's a negative memory, but you no longer have emotions about that. An example of a woman who did not get through the tunnel is a woman who was near death and said to her family, "Don't tell my daughter when I die." That is a person clearly that never got through the tunnel. Another example of people who amaze me by getting through the tunnel are persons who have endured wrongful incarceration. I think that we're seeing more and more of those today, as every state now has an Innocence Project. You all know that, certainly lawyers all know, it was started here at the University of Cincinnati. And I'm amazed when I hear people interviewed, or Trish and I have had 2 persons that gave talks about their wrongful incarceration and attended those talks. And I'm always amazed at the upbeat mood that they have. And finally, one of them gave the answer that I had been looking for. And he said, I realized until I turned loose of the anger and the resentment and the unfairness, until I turned loose of all that, I would still be in prison. And I thought that was a great example of what I'm saying, that to work through a trauma, it has to become a negative memory without emotion. Now, the research that I mentioned, I want to give you another example of a person who worked through the trauma. This is a young woman years ago who was kidnapped here in Cincinnati, held for 2 days, 48 hours, had the presence of mind. She was blindfolded, put in the floorboard of the car, had the incredible presence of mind, and I'll be talking about this part of the brain later, to remember every turn the car took out of the parking lot. And that led the detectives to apprehend the person, and he remained in jail until his death. She went on, and an example of a person who uses trauma to gain strength. She went on and finished medical school and has a very, very successful medical practice in another state, and is highly sought after as a motivational speaker. Now, the study I want to tell you about is by a gentleman whose name is Norman Doidge, D-O-I-D-G-E. He did an amazing thing, because up until his fairly simple research project, the medical world always believed that the brain is hardwired. We've always heard people say, well, you're dealt a hand of cards, and it's up to you to make the most of that and to play that hand as best you can. Norman, who is an MD, recruited a group of patients who had suffered strokes and had had one arm paralyzed. Now again, up until now, the medical world believed the brain was very static and could not be induced to change. He got people to take care of these patients because what he did was to disable their good arm. He taped the good arm to their body so they now had no arm to use. And lo and behold, to the surprise of the medical world, the paralyzed arm began to have movement and began to be useful. Now, the medical world would not accept that. And so he kept doing it over and over. And finally, he did enough of those studies that the physicians in the world had no choice but to accept, yes, the brain can change and can understand what's needed for us and can make that happen in many cases. To take advantage of this finding, I find it's useful to think of the brain in two parts, two major functions. One is the emotional function of the brain, which is, of course, very interesting, and it allows us to have a good time. The emotional part is totally into indulgence. It has no sense of consequences and has no boundaries. The other part is what I call the CEO/regulator. Now, that part is not, brain studies show, that part is not mature until men are 25 years old. It was 24, and just recently that's been changed to 25. They're finding that men are still struggling to mature. Women, the study shows that part of their brain, the judgment part, is mature by 22. Now, the problem with people making decisions before those ages, they're not dealing with a full deck of cards. And I often say to teenagers who are not always receptive to mentoring, I tell them to pick out any adult they know that is successful, and I can guarantee them that person has had mentors along the way. And tell them if they don't have a mentor, the best thing they can do for themselves is to go find one. Now, research also shows, brain research also shows that, and this is another very interesting finding, that when people get in a fit of rage, and we've all heard that phrase, and this applies to women and men, when they get in a fit of rage, this CEO regulator closes down. I also think that when people develop serious obsessions, like some of the shooters in our world that have become so obsessed about whatever they find to be to hate, I think the brain, that part of the brain, closes down in those folks. That has not been proven by research, but it's something that I think is very likely. I'll tell you my mentor story. When I was in a rural high school in Kentucky and 2 months from graduation, I was planning to get out of school, buy a new Chevrolet, go in debt for it, get a job on somebody's farm, because while my parents were wonderful, loving persons, they never finished high school and never owned land. So 2 months before graduation, a teacher that everybody was terrified of stopped me in the hallway. And I froze. I thought I'd done something wrong. And she said, now this woman had never mentored me up until this moment and never mentored me after this moment. But she said to me, have you ever thought of going to college? I said, no. And she said, you should. And turned around and walked off. Well, 4 months later, I was enrolled at UK, became a night guard at a nearby reformatory, and went to classes during the day. And it was on my way to where I am today. One interaction, yes. It was like she turned a light on in my brain. Now I was second in my class, and out of that high school class, there was only one other person that went to college. That's how rural it was, and I never remember college being mentioned in my home or in my classrooms. Now, if you can accept the CEO role, and it's important to accept that, to visualize that, and have it live side by side with your emotional self. And because if you accept that role, then we can talk about what tools can we give the CEO to make it more efficient. And one tool that I like is, whose issue is it? It's a very interesting tool. And the example is the breadwinner comes home and dinner's not ready, and he or she barks at the other one and says, why isn't it ready? And the one that's already in the house says, well, if you made more money, I could hire somebody to help, and so they're in a fight. The CEO that has tools says, the one that's already in the home, when he or she comes through the door, says, sounds like you've had a bad day. Tell me about it. And that's a whole different conversation. Another example, a woman, a friend of mine, we were all at a lecture, and afterwards she said to me, she said, you know, when we stood up for the speaker, I didn't stand up. And the woman next to me, a total stranger, challenged me and said, why didn't you stand up? And so my friend was trying to find reasons to explain to her, and I said, what if you had said to the stranger, I'm surprised, does that bother you, or why would you wonder why I did not stand up? And again, you have a whole different conversation when you use that tool. The other tool, and by the way, my assistant who typed up my notes came back yesterday morning and said, guess what? She said, my husband and I of 25 years had our first conversation on a sensitive issue without a fight because I used your tool. Whose issue is it? And the other tool is what I call the mirror effect. And that is you mirror, and there's been some research on this, and particularly the research has been done with children. You mirror back what you see. If somebody looks grumpy, you take note of that and say, wow, you really look like you've had a tough day. Johnny hits his sister. While there may be a sanction for that, the verbal part is, Johnny, tell me what's going on. Are you jealous of your sister? And you get Johnny to answer that question. And if Johnny says, or your spouse says, I don't know, you say, think about it because I'm going to ask you tomorrow. Now, what this begins to do is to establish a credibility in your relationships. So it's not your issue. Somebody has challenged you. You reflect that back along with reflecting back any observations you're making of their body language or what's going on. And you'll find amazing responses to that. People often then will talk about what's going on, what they're stressed about, why they're upset, and you avoid that escalation that people use to relieve stress by fighting. So I'm thinking here what I want to leave time for us. Keep remembering ways that you strengthen your CEO. You do it by research. You look up research studies. A good CEO is data-based. An emotional part of your brain is never data-based. It's pleasure-based. It's not known for setting boundaries for itself. It's never known for thinking through the consequences. I had a person 15 years ago or so that called me on a Sunday. This is a person that Trish and I know. And she said, can I come over right now? I've been offered a great job that would require me to fly, but I haven't flown in years because I'm terrified. She came over. She and her husband came over. I asked Trish to take the husband for a 50-minute walk, since a 50-minute hour is typical. So they went for a walk, and I talked to her, and first thing I said, what is the most comfortable place you've ever been in your life? And she quickly said, in my grandfather's lap. And I said, okay, let's think about that. And this is a woman who's very focused, very intentional. And I said, can you get to a point that anytime your anxiety goes up, you emotionally take yourself to his lap? And she said, yeah, I think I can do that. So we talked for the 50 minutes and practiced that. And that week, she accepted the job, began flying. That was about 15 years ago, and has never stopped flying. And to this day, occasionally will text me and say, my CEO is doing great. I had another example of a man who retired from a large company here in the city, and he had developed a close friendship with a person who lived in Japan who also retired and moved to Japan. And this person had developed a phobia of flying also, and was so much wanting to go to Japan to see his friend, but simply could not even buy the ticket. He could not even think of it. So we met on and off for 2 weeks. The result, and I explained this whole CEO part of the brain, how we equip it, how that CEO part is always reassuring the emotional part. And the analogy I use with people is, think of when your kids were small. You had to do a lot of reassuring with them. You put a small child to bed and he or she calls you later and says, there's a ghost in my room. Well, you go in and you turn the lights on and you say, let's look under the bed, and in the closet, there's no ghosts here. You reassure and you say, I'll leave this light on. You can call me if you need me. So I explain to adults they need to treat themselves the same way. So your CEO part is interacting with the emotional part and reassuring and saying, we can do this. So this man, after 2 weeks, he bought his ticket, went to Japan, texted me from Japan and said, I love my CEO. I'm having a great time because I'm not gripped with fear. He's back, had a great trip, and is planning to go back in December because his CEO took over the task of reassuring that emotional self. So in closing, embrace the idea that those two parts of your brain are always interacting. The CEO can never go off duty. That's a disaster when it goes off duty. It can sometimes just observe. It doesn't always have to be slowing down the emotional self or curtailing it. But as I said earlier, you equip your CEO with tools. You strengthen it your whole life. You help people around you develop their rational selves so that they too know how to protect any joy that they have, how to build joy because their lives are going so much better than when that CEO is not on the job. In fact, many times when people come into my office and tell me about some stupid thing they did, my first question after listening is, where was your CEO? Obviously, he or she was not on duty, and that's a disaster. You can never allow that to happen. And we read in the papers every day of people whose CEOs clearly were not on duty, which enabled them or permitted them to do things that wreck their careers and wreck their lives and wreck their families. So, never go off duty. Think of your CEO. Take inventory of yourselves. Be quiet at times and be with yourself. I always say on your way home, leave the radio off and think about what tools you need to be successful in that home. The tools you have to be successful in the workplace may not work in the home, so think about that. Think about your CEO. Anything new you need to send to your CEO to help him or her function better. So with that, I'm going to stop, and Bob, you can ask the first question. You can use your CEO to ask the first question.
So if you have a well-developed CEO, the question really is, does that help you through the mental immunity thing?
Absolutely.
For example, I think we all know that experience is what we get right after we need it.
Yes.
So the thing about mental immunity, you have to go through the difficult things that lawyers do, where they either lose the client, they might lose the case, or they might even get sued for malpractice. So those, all
Yes.
of us experience some of those things during our career. So when we experience those, does a well-developed CEO help us through all of that?
Well, absolutely. I think the CEO protects the ocean depth, the depth in our souls, our personalities, that because we should have a compartment in ourselves that appreciates life, and that needs nurturing also. I think there's quiet times that we remember what we're thankful for, and what we feel joy about. And to answer your question, think of the ocean surface, that all the things you just mentioned are surface issues. Now they result in stress, they require a lot of fixing and repairing and so on. But they should never invade your soul. They should never invade what you feel joy about. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't get down on yourself. And I think today of counseling as being coaching. And I often say to people, it doesn't mean you have to have a diagnosis to be counseled. But if you can't do this on your own to develop your CEO, I gave you 2 examples of people who came in a very brief time. We shored up the CEO part of the brain, and they were able to protect that, what I and you're calling, that joy, that happiness about life. So I believe that that's the brilliance of Deutsch's research, that shows the brain wants to help us. And I've always felt, long before that research, that the brain naturally moves toward trying to make life better for us, making better choices for us. Many people don't listen to that side. We know that. How many people have we heard say, I just wish I'd listened to my intuition? Well, that was a CEO trying to say, don't do that. Another question? Yes?
So how do you deal with people who don't have joy? Like who are,
I'm sorry, that don't have what?
that don't have joy, that have
Yes.
that whose emotional part of their brain has
Yeah.
taken their.
Well, in my experience, I think those are people that have not worked through all their traumas. And a lot of that can be trauma from childhood. I have one patient that I've seen for many years, and she only comes in once a month now, but she was beaten during childhood. She had her teeth knocked out by her mother, and I think that it's been very difficult for her to get past that and to repair those wounds and to feel joy about her life. And I believe that to help people to that point, you have to first heal and clean the clutter out of whatever is in the way of them feeling joy. Because I think that most everybody, not everyone, but most everyone, I think, has things to be thankful about. But if that's being blocked by the resentment, the guilt, the depression, you got to first help them with that. So that's the first thing I check on with people like that. Yes?
Do you have any, one of your tools,
Huh?
let's say you have someone that has, their CEO is often absent, and especially if they have a lot of anxiety or
Yeah.
bipolar,
Yes.
that it builds up and they're almost compelled to jab until they
Yeah.
so they can explode.
Yes.
Because they
Yes.
almost need to let it off. So as as someone who's trying to help someone like that, have you found, are there any, I know there's no magic words, but do you have any advice for how to somehow lessen that so that
Yes.
they can get back to reality?
One of the things I do is to help people understand the difference between fear and anxiety. It's a very interesting difference. Anxiety is always anticipatory. People anticipate negative things are going to happen. You know, the typical example is a person is getting ready to cross the street and standing on the curb worrying, what if a car runs the red light and kills me? That's anxiety. Now, if you're in the middle of the crosswalk and somebody's running the red light, then that's fear. Fear is reality-based. And so helping persons like you're talking about understand that difference and begin to decrease the anticipatory type of anxiety that's cranking up their fears and causing them to be unhappy in their lives. And so we start with that and helping them to identify what is your reality versus what is your anxiety. And that can begin to de-escalate. And de-escalation is the key word there, to get people to calm down. You know, most of what people worry about is anticipatory. It's anticipatory, and that's been proven by study after study. Yes?
There are occasional reports about different countries having levels of happiness.
Yes.
And how can you reconcile your challenges to joy and happiness with these countries? Because I presume they all have the same elements, but yet some of them are ranked higher or lower.
So are you saying what about some countries that enhances happiness? Is that what you're thinking?
I don't know what enhances it. That I'm asking you.
Yes.
How do you reconcile your challenges with these countries being happier than others?
Well, I think that comes down to an individual by individual issue. I think that going back to, I do an inventory when I work with somebody, and we look at genetics and we look at habit behavior, how much of your unhappiness is based on some habits that you need to change. And we begin to talk about what, from that inventory, what needs to change. Now the question then becomes to the person, are you willing to try some new behaviors? I often say to a person, go out and try it for 2 weeks, come back and let's talk about how it's going and how you're feeling. Are you finding that if you use some of these tools that you're feeling better about yourself, you're not on the defensive? If it's not your issue, you don't try to answer it. So that, I don't know if that answers your question, but I began to try to find out why the unhappiness level is high in some people. And most of the time I find it's anticipatory, anxiety. Sometimes that's hereditary and you have to try to break that habit. But again, the beauty of the brain study shows that we can break patterns, we can break genetics, and can get the brain to work on our behalf. Yes, Bob?
Laura, you mentioned that the increased number of suicides.
Yes.
Was 37, and I think all of us probably attribute some of that to these wonderful devices that are able to communicate, and sometimes communicate in a way that is not very caring and
Yes.
rude and awful. And I wonder, the schools just came out with a report in terms of their objectives for children. One of the things that was asked of them, things that they want children to develop, is compassion for others. I'm thinking, is there an age at which it's appropriate for that really to become a focus point of education in terms of like developing emotional intelligence, or is there, what would you say to the school board in terms of compassion
Yeah.
for others? When should they be concerned about that?
Well, we start with preschool children. One of my programs is children 5 and under. And we start with 4-year-olds, trying to build in some sense of the impact they're having on kids around them. And the schools, I think, are not doing as good a job in that you might call that social conditioning. I also heard a national report a few months ago that the effort in this country to reduce smoking has been incredibly successful. We went from a country that 50% of adults smoked to now it's 15%. But there was massive education. There was public education. They put warnings on every cigarette pack. They have not done that with drugs. Schools have not done that with drugs. We've not made this huge effort to explain to kids, young people, how dangerous it is to use these drugs. And we're now beginning to see some of the results, brain damage and so on. But I think, what was your question? I don't know if I answered it or not. Yeah.
You're starting with kids that are 4 years old.
I'm starting with kids 4 years old to do the social conditioning, to say, to use the tool. Don't teach them the tool, but we use the tool to say, tell me why you are unhappy today. Why are you feeling critical of your teacher, of your classmates? So we begin that accountability and getting the person to talk about it. So the whole point of helping people learn how to articulate what causes their behavior. Now again, that's changing that habitual behavior to intentional behavior. So we have some kids at age 4 and 5, for example, that bump into furniture or they bump into other kids. They don't have the ability to assess the space their body is in versus other people around them. So that's an occupational therapy issue. So we have occupational therapists that come in and work with our counselors to help those children. So it's all of those things that we do starting at 4 and 5 years of age and on up to teach that. Yes?
Why do you figure there's only 4 guys here versus the rest of the room?
You know your group, you'd have to answer that.
Whose problem is that?
Right, right. That's good, Bob. It'd be good to ask some of your men co-workers where they were today and where their CEOs are. Okay, any last questions? Thank you, and good luck building your CEOs, strengthen those, help people around you strengthen those, and I can absolutely guarantee you it gives you a better chance of protecting your joy and building your joy, because anytime any of us are functioning well, no matter what we're dealing with, all the things that Bob mentioned that people can deal with, if our CEO is functioning, it becomes logical based, data based, it's making good judgments, it's checking its resources, it's checking its options. That's only going to improve your life and your functioning and preserve any joy that you have. Thanks.